In 1960, the most beloved concert hall in America faced execution by its own city government. Carnegie Hall, where the greatest musicians of 70 years had performed, where acoustic perfection had been achieved through methods still not fully understood, where American culture had been elevated beyond measure, would fall to a developer's wrecking ball. The sale was completed. The replacement tower was designed. The demolition date was set. New York City was preparing to destroy what it could never rebuild. Then Isaac Stern began organizing a rebellion. Musicians, conductors, and ordinary citizens who understood what was at stake mounted a campaign that would reshape how America protected its cultural heritage. This is the story of Carnegie Hall and the last-minute rescue that saved an irreplaceable masterpiece. Andrew Carnegie was born in November of 1,835 inches, Dunfermline, Scotland, in a one-room weaver's cottage where his entire family lived and worked. His father, William, operated a hand loom in the front room, producing damask linen for wealthy clients. His mother, Margaret, mended shoes to supplement the household income. The Carnegies were poor, but William's skilled craft provided modest security. Then the power loom arrived in Scotland. Within a few years, mechanization destroyed the hand loom trade entirely. William Carnegie found himself without work, without prospects, watching his family sink toward destitution. In 1848, when Andrew was 12 years old, the Carnegies made the decision that millions of desperate Europeans were making. They would emigrate to America. The family borrowed money for passage and sailed to New York, then traveled inland to Allegheny, Pennsylvania, where Margaret's sisters had settled. They arrived with almost nothing. Andrew's first job in America was in a cotton mill, working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week as a bobbin boy. He earned $1.20 per week. He was 13 years old. The work was brutal and mindless, but Andrew possessed something that would define his entire life: ambition that bordered on desperation. He taught himself double-entry bookkeeping at night. He memorized the faces and names of Pittsburgh's business elite. When a position opened for a telegraph messenger boy, he applied immediately and was hired at $2.50 per week. The telegraph office changed everything. Young Carnegie delivered messages to railroad executives, bank presidents, and iron manufacturers. He made himself indispensable, arriving early and staying late. When the telegraph operators took breaks, he taught himself to translate the clicking sounds into words. Within a year, he was one of the fastest telegraphers in Pittsburgh. In 1853, Thomas Scott, superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division, hired Carnegie as his personal secretary and telegraph operator. The salary was $35 per month, a fortune compared to the cotton mill. More importantly, Scott became Carnegie's mentor, teaching him how capital worked, how investments multiplied, how men with vision could transform modest savings into substantial wealth. Scott encouraged Carnegie to make his first investment in 1856, 10 shares of Adams Express Company at $500 total, purchased with money borrowed from a local banker. When the first dividend check arrived, Carnegie reportedly stared at it in disbelief. Money earned from owning something, not from labor. The concept revolutionized his understanding of how fortunes were built. Carnegie began investing in oil, iron, railroads, bridge companies. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad through the Civil War, managing military transportation for the Union. But increasingly, his investments demanded attention. In 1865, at age 29, he resigned from the railroad to focus entirely on his business ventures. His income that year from investments exceeded $50,000. The fortune came from steel. Carnegie recognized that America's industrial expansion would require unprecedented quantities of iron and steel for railroads, buildings, bridges, machinery. He purchased ironworks, built blast furnaces, integrated operations from raw materials to finished products. He drove costs down relentlessly through vertical integration and technological innovation. By the 1,880 Carnegie Steel was the largest and most profitable steel company in America. But Carnegie was different from other industrial titans. While men like Rockefeller and Morgan accumulated wealth with single-minded focus, Carnegie developed a peculiar philosophy about money that would shape the rest of his life. He believed that dying rich was dying disgraced. In 1889, he published an essay titled The Gospel of Wealth in the North American Review. The argument was revolutionary for its time. Wealthy men, Carnegie wrote, were merely trustees of their fortunes. They held capital temporarily to be administered for the benefit of the community. The essay made Carnegie famous beyond business circles. It also made him a target for critics, who pointed out the contradiction between his stated philosophy and his business practices. Carnegie Steel crushed competitors, fought unions brutally, and extracted every possible advantage from workers and suppliers. The man who preached social responsibility operated one of the most ruthless enterprises in America. Carnegie seemed genuinely troubled by this contradiction. He began distributing his wealth while still actively building his fortune. Libraries became his signature cause. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie money would fund the construction of 2,509 libraries across the English-speaking world. Among his lesser-known passions was music. Carnegie could not read musical notation well. He had no formal training, but he worshipped great performers with the fervor of a convert. He attended concerts whenever business allowed, traveled to Europe specifically to hear legendary musicians, and mourned that America lacked venues worthy of the world's finest artists. In the 1,880 seconds, New York City possessed no permanent home for its orchestras. The Metropolitan Opera House, opened in 1883, served opera exclusively. The Academy of Music on 14th Street was too small and acoustically flawed. Visiting orchestras and soloists performed in rented halls, theaters, and churches, none designed specifically for symphonic music. For a city that considered itself America's cultural capital, this was an embarrassment. The idea of building a great concert hall apparently emerged during conversations between Carnegie and Walter Damrosch, conductor of the New York Symphony Society. Damrosch had been pleading for years for a proper venue. Carnegie listened, calculated, and made a decision that surprised even his closest associates. He would finance the construction of a concert hall that would surpass anything in America and rival the finest halls of Europe. The announcement came in 1887. Carnegie would personally fund the construction of a music hall at 57th Street and 7th Avenue. The location drew immediate skepticism. At that time, fashionable New York ended somewhere around 42nd Street. The area near 57th Street was largely undeveloped, considered too far north for serious cultural institutions. Critics predicted the hall would fail, simply because audiences would refuse to travel to such a remote location. Carnegie ignored them. He had learned from his railroad investments that neighborhoods followed infrastructure. The elevated trains were extending northward. Central Park's success had made the Upper East Side desirable. The West Side would follow. He was building not for 1,887, but for the New York that would exist in 1900 and beyond. For the architect, Carnegie made an unusual choice. He selected William Burnett Tuthill, a relatively unknown designer who had built a few private homes and church buildings, but nothing on this scale. Tuthill's advantage was his passion for acoustics. He had studied concert halls across Europe, measured their dimensions, analyzed their materials, and developed theories about how sound behaved in enclosed spaces. Carnegie wanted acoustic perfection above architectural grandeur. Tuthill promised to deliver it. Construction began in 1889. Tuthill designed the building in the Italian Renaissance style, though stripped of excessive ornamentation. The focus was function, not decoration. Every decision served acoustic perfection. The site measured 150 feet on 57th Street and 200 feet on 7th Avenue. Tuthill organized the structure around a main auditorium capable of seating approximately 2,800 people, with a smaller recital hall and several chamber music rooms occupying the upper floors. The main hall's dimensions were calculated with obsessive precision. Tuthill had concluded from his European research that certain proportions produced superior sound. He designed a shoebox shape roughly 150 feet long, 115 feet wide, and 60 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest point. The walls were never parallel. Tuthill angled them slightly to prevent sound waves from bouncing directly back and forth, which would create dead spots and echoes. The ceiling was not flat, but gently curved, shaped to diffuse sound evenly throughout the space. Every surface was covered in plaster mixed to a specific formula that Tuthill believed would absorb and reflect frequencies in ideal balance. The stage was relatively shallow by modern standards, designed for orchestras of 80 to 100 musicians. Behind the performers, Tuthill installed massive sliding doors that could be opened to reveal additional seating in what was called the dress circle. This architectural feature would later prove crucial during the hall's opening week, when demand for tickets exceeded all expectations. Tuthill paid extraordinary attention to materials. The plaster for the walls and ceiling was mixed from lime, sand, and horsehair according to a formula he developed himself. The proportions were carefully guarded. Workers applied it in multiple thin layers rather than a single thick coat, creating a surface that was simultaneously hard and slightly porous. This combination, Tuthill believed, would allow the hall to breathe acoustically. The floor was wood over a crawl space that left an air gap beneath the audience. This would prevent sound from being absorbed into the earth below. The seats were upholstered in a particular fabric selected for its acoustic properties, firm enough to reflect some sound even when occupied, soft enough to avoid creating harsh echoes when empty. The construction budget was approximately $1.1 million, an enormous sum for the era. Carnegie paid it without complaint. When contractors proposed cost-saving measures, Tuthill rejected them if they compromised acoustics. Carnegie supported his architect completely. He was building for immortality, not quarterly profits. The name chosen was simply Music Hall, though newspapers immediately began calling it Carnegie Music Hall or Carnegie Hall. The formal corporate name was the Music Hall Company of New York. Carnegie held the majority of shares, but structured it as a business venture rather than pure philanthropy. He expected the hall to generate revenue sufficient to cover operating costs, though not necessarily to return his investment. By early 1891, the structure was complete. Tuthill had created something unprecedented in American architecture. Whether his acoustic theories would prove correct remained to be seen. The hall had never been tested with a full orchestra and audience. Everything was speculation and calculation until opening night. For that crucial first performance, Carnegie wanted the most prestigious musical figure available. His choice was Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was 50 years old in 1891, at the height of his fame and creative powers. His symphonies and ballets had conquered European audiences. He was recognized as one of the greatest living composers, but he had never visited America. He disliked travel, struggled with depression and anxiety, and generally avoided public appearances beyond conducting his own works. Carnegie's emissaries approached Tchaikovsky in early 1890 with an extraordinary offer. He would receive $2,500 to conduct 5 concerts in New York during the hall's opening festival, plus travel expenses for himself and his entourage. In today's currency, that fee would exceed $75,000. It was an offer calculated to overcome any reluctance. Tchaikovsky accepted, though his private letters revealed deep anxiety about the journey. He sailed from France in late April 1891, arriving in New York on April 27th. The city overwhelmed him. He found Americans brash and exhausting, their cities too loud, their pace too frantic, but he was moved by their genuine enthusiasm for serious music. The opening night was scheduled for May 5th, 1891. The program would feature Tchaikovsky's own compositions, including the American premiere of his Marche Solennelle, written specifically for the occasion. The New York Symphony Society and the Oratorio Society of New York would provide approximately 300 performers. Tickets sold out within days of being released. The event had captured public imagination beyond the usual classical music audience. This was history being made, America announcing itself as a serious participant in world culture. fashionable New York, prepared to travel to the remote northern location to witness it. The afternoon before opening night, Tchaikovsky attended the final rehearsal. The orchestra assembled on the untested stage. Tuthill watched nervously from the rear of the hall. When the first notes sounded, Tchaikovsky reportedly stopped conducting and simply listened. The acoustic perfection that Tuthill had calculated, measured, and built was real. The sound was clear and warm and balanced. Every instrument could be heard distinctly, yet blended perfectly with the whole. Pianissimo passages carried to the furthest seats without amplification. Fortissimo swells had power without harshness. The hall worked. On the evening of May 5th, 1891, approximately 2,800 people filled every seat. Carnegie himself sat in a box with his new wife, Louise Whitfield, whom he had married the previous year. Walter Damrosch, whose advocacy had helped initiate the entire project, was in the audience. New York's social and cultural elite had made the journey uptown. Tchaikovsky walked onto the stage at approximately 8:15 p.m. The audience rose in ovation before a single note was played. The composer bowed, turned to his orchestra, and raised his baton. The opening night program included his Marche Solennelle, the Coronation March from the Maid of Orleans, and selections from the Nutcracker, which had not yet premiered in Russia. Contemporary accounts describe the audience's reaction as ecstatic. The hall's acoustics exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. Critics who had dismissed the location now praised Carnegie's vision. The skeptics had been proven wrong on every count. Tchaikovsky conducted 4 more concerts during the opening festival, each to sold-out audiences. His presence had legitimized the new hall in a way no American musician could have achieved. When he departed New York on May 21st, he left behind an institution that had instantly become essential to the city's cultural life. The genius of Tuthill's design became clearer with each performance. Musicians who had played in halls across Europe declared Carnegie Hall acoustically superior to most of them. The sound was warm without being muddy, clear without being harsh. A single violin could be heard perfectly in the furthest balcony seat. A full orchestra at maximum power never became overwhelming. The secret lay in details that most audience members never consciously noticed. The plaster walls, applied in those multiple thin layers, created a surface that was microscopically irregular. Sound waves scattered and diffused rather than bouncing cleanly back. The slightly angled walls prevented standing waves. The curved ceiling distributed reflections evenly. The air gap beneath the wooden floor added resonance without boom. Every element worked together in ways that Tuthill had theorized but could not fully predict. What made the achievement more remarkable was that Tuthill had accomplished it through empirical observation and practical experimentation rather than advanced physics. The mathematical understanding of acoustics in 1891 was primitive compared to modern knowledge. Tuthill had measured European halls, noted what worked, discarded what failed, and synthesized his own principles. His methods were part craft, part intuition, part luck. The result was perfection that later generations of acousticians, armed with computers and sophisticated analysis, would struggle to replicate. The building itself was elegant but not ostentatious. The exterior featured buff-colored brick with Renaissance-style arched windows. The entrance on 57th Street was marked by a 3-story arch, dignified rather than grand. Inside, the main hall was finished in cream and gold, with 5 tiers of seating rising steeply from the orchestra level. The stage was framed by a proscenium arch, behind which those sliding doors could reveal additional seating when needed. Carnegie had wanted a hall that served music, not a monument to his ego. His name appeared nowhere on the building's exterior when it opened. The simplicity was deliberate. This was a workshop for artists, not a palace for patrons. In the months following opening night, the hall established the pattern that would define it for decades. The New York Symphony Society and the Oratorio Society became resident organizations, performing regularly throughout each season. But the hall also welcomed visiting orchestras, touring soloists, chamber ensembles, and eventually even popular entertainers. Carnegie had built it to serve all music, not merely the most rarefied classical repertoire. The legends came quickly. In November 1891, Ignacy Jan Paderewski made his American debut at Carnegie Hall. The Polish pianist had conquered Europe but remained unknown in America. His first New York recital changed that instantly. Contemporary accounts describe audience members weeping openly, rushing the stage after the final notes, demanding encores until nearly midnight. Paderewski would return to Carnegie Hall repeatedly over the next 4 decades, each appearance an event. Gustav Mahler conducted the New York Philharmonic at Carnegie Hall, beginning in 1909. The Austrian composer-conductor was in the final years of his life, struggling with heart disease and personal tragedy. But his performances at Carnegie Hall during those last seasons created memories that survived generations. Musicians who heard him there as children would describe the experience decades later with undimmed reverence. Enrico Caruso sang at Carnegie Hall repeatedly between 1904 and 1920. The Italian tenor was the most famous operatic voice of his era, commanding fees that made him wealthy beyond any singer before him. He could have performed anywhere. He chose Carnegie Hall for his New York concert appearances because the acoustics allowed him to sing with full power without forcing his voice. The hall enhanced, rather than fought, the natural resonance of his instrument. Sergei Rachmaninoff gave his American piano debut at Carnegie Hall in November 1909. He performed his Piano Concerto No. 2, the work that had restored his confidence after a nervous breakdown. The audience received it with enthusiasm that surprised the composer, who had arrived in America uncertain of his reception. He would return to Carnegie Hall more than 40 times over the next 3 decades, considering it his American home. Arturo Toscanini conducted the New York Philharmonic at Carnegie Hall from 1926 to 1936. The Italian maestro was a tyrant at rehearsals, demanding perfection from every musician, but audiences experienced only the results of that obsessive preparation. His interpretations of Beethoven, Brahms, and Verdi set standards that subsequent conductors measured themselves against. The hall accommodated every musical style with equal grace. Jazz found a home there beginning in the 1932. Benny Goodman's 1938 concert, featuring Count Basie and members of the Duke Ellington Orchestra, demonstrated that Carnegie Hall could serve swing music as perfectly as symphony. The event marked jazz's acceptance into mainstream American culture, the music of Black America validated by performance in the temple of European classical tradition. Carnegie himself attended regularly until his death in 1919. He maintained a private box and rarely missed performances by artists he admired. He reportedly wept openly during particularly moving concerts, unashamed to show emotion in public. The hall had become his greatest philanthropic achievement, surpassing even his library program in cultural impact. His death at age 83 marked a transition for the institution he had created. Carnegie had operated the hall as a semi-commercial venture, covering costs through ticket sales while accepting modest losses when necessary. His estate had no particular interest in continuing that arrangement. In 1925, the Carnegie family sold the building to Robert E. Simon Sr., a New York real estate developer, for $2 million. Simon was a music lover who understood what he had purchased. He had no intention of demolishing or fundamentally altering a building that had achieved something close to perfection. Under his ownership, Carnegie Hall continued to function exactly as before. The resident orchestras maintained their schedules, touring artists performed to sold-out houses. The Golden Age that had begun under Carnegie continued uninterrupted. The 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds brought new generations of legendary performers. Vladimir Horowitz made his American debut at Carnegie Hall in January 1928. The Ukrainian pianist was 24 years old, virtually unknown in America, booked as a last-minute replacement for an indisposed pianist. He chose to perform Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1, the same work the composer had conducted at the hall's opening 37 years earlier. Horowitz played with such ferocious technical brilliance and emotional intensity that the audience interrupted the performance with ovation after the first movement. Critics the next morning declared that a new keyboard giant had arrived. Horowitz would perform at Carnegie Hall more than 200 times over the next 6 decades, his relationship with the building becoming one of the great artistic partnerships in musical history. Arthur Rubinstein gave annual recitals at Carnegie Hall from the 1,920 seconds through the 1,970 seconds. The Polish pianist specialized in Chopin, and his interpretation set the standard by which all others were judged. He reportedly loved the hall's acoustics so deeply that he insisted on practicing there before concerts, something few artists were permitted to do. The maintenance staff would open the building for him at odd hours, allowing him to sit alone on the stage and listen to how his instrument spoke in that particular space. Marian Anderson sang at Carnegie Hall in 1928, one of the first African-American classical singers to perform there. She returned repeatedly throughout her career, each appearance a statement about artistic excellence transcending racial barriers. Her 1,939 Carnegie Hall concert, which came shortly after the Daughters of the American Revolution had barred her from Constitution Hall in Washington, demonstrated that at least some American institutions valued talent over prejudice. The hall adapted to changing musical tastes without losing its essential character. Jazz became a regular part of the programming. Duke Ellington and his orchestra performed there numerous times, beginning in the 1,930 seconds. Billie Holiday sang at Carnegie Hall in 1946 and again in 1948, her voice filling the space with the same intimacy it brought to small nightclubs. The acoustics that served Beethoven's symphonies also served the blues. Folk music found acceptance there as well. Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, and Leadbelly all appeared on the Carnegie Hall stage during the 1,940 seconds. The hall that had once represented European high culture was becoming something more democratic, a venue that honored all forms of serious musical expression. But the building's finances were becoming problematic. Robert E. Simon Sr. died in 1935. His son, Robert E. Simon Jr., inherited the property along with the complexities of maintaining a 40-year-old structure in Manhattan's increasingly valuable real estate market. Maintenance costs were substantial and rising. The building required constant attention. Plaster needed repair. The heating system was aging. The stage equipment needed updating. Simon Jr. funded these expenses from rental income, but profit margins were thin. Carnegie Hall was valuable as real estate but marginal as a business. By the early 1,950 seconds, the neighborhood around the hall had transformed completely. The area that had seemed impossibly remote in 1891 was now the heart of Midtown Manhattan. Office towers surrounded Carnegie Hall on all sides. The land beneath it had become extraordinarily valuable. Developers and real estate investors began approaching Simon with offers to purchase. The economics were simple and brutal. Carnegie Hall generated perhaps $200,000 annually in rental income after expenses. The land it occupied was worth millions. A modern office tower on the site could generate far more revenue than concerts ever would. To a purely rational investor, demolishing Carnegie Hall made perfect sense. Simon resisted these offers through the early 1,950 seconds. He understood what the building represented culturally, even if it made little sense financially. But by 1955, he could no longer maintain the property without substantial capital investment. The building needed major repairs that he could not afford to finance from operating income. In 1955, Simon announced that Carnegie Hall was for sale. The asking price was $5 million. The music world received the news with alarm but no immediate action. Everyone assumed someone would step forward to save it. Carnegie Hall was too important to lose. Surely the city would intervene, or a wealthy patron would emerge, or some solution would materialize. No one stepped forward. By early 1956, a commercial developer had made an offer that Simon felt obligated to accept. The buyer intended to demolish the building and construct a modern office tower. The plan was entirely legal. Carnegie Hall had no special protection under city or state law. It was simply private property whose owner had chosen to sell to the highest bidder. The announcement that Carnegie Hall would be demolished generated newspaper headlines and editorial condemnation. But outrage alone could not save the building. New York, in the 1,950 seconds, was in the grip of what was called urban renewal, a philosophy that treated old buildings as obstacles to progress. The master of this movement was Robert Moses, the unelected but enormously powerful urban planner who had shaped New York's development for 3 decades. Moses believed that cities needed to be rebuilt constantly to remain economically viable. Old structures, no matter how beautiful or historically significant, had to be sacrificed when they stood in the way of modernization. He had overseen the destruction of neighborhoods across the city, displacing tens of thousands of residents to make room for highways, housing projects, and commercial development. Carnegie Hall was exactly the kind of building Moses considered expendable. It was old. It served a limited audience. It occupied valuable land. The fact that it was acoustically perfect and culturally irreplaceable did not factor into his calculations. Progress required sacrifice. The threat to Carnegie Hall was not unique. Across America, cities were demolishing historic structures at an unprecedented rate. Penn Station in New York, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece that had served as the city's Grand Railroad terminal since 1910, would be torn down in 1963 to make way for the current Madison Square Garden. The loss of Penn Station would eventually galvanize the historic preservation movement, but that awakening came too late to save it. Carnegie Hall faced the same fate. Without legal protection, without government intervention, without a buyer willing to preserve it, the building would fall. The wrecking crews were being scheduled. The replacement tower was being designed. The countdown had begun. The musicians mobilized first. Leonard Bernstein, who had conducted at Carnegie Hall countless times, began making phone calls to wealthy patrons and city officials. He understood what was at stake, not just aesthetically but practically. The New York Philharmonic performed most of its concerts at Carnegie Hall. If the building vanished, the orchestra would have nowhere to play. Vladimir Horowitz added his voice. The pianist who had performed there more than any other living artist wrote letters to newspapers and spoke to anyone who would listen. Carnegie Hall, he insisted, was not merely a building. It was an instrument, as carefully crafted and irreplaceable as any Stradivarius violin. But the most effective advocate proved to be Isaac Stern. The violinist had performed at Carnegie Hall regularly since his debut there in 1943. He knew the building intimately, understood its acoustics, and recognized that nothing built with modern methods could replicate what Tuthill had achieved through 19th-century craftsmanship and intuition. Stern began organizing a campaign to save the hall in early 1960. He was 39 years old, at the peak of his career and influence. He contacted every musician he knew who had performed at Carnegie Hall. He reached out to conductors, composers, and music educators. He enlisted the support of the American Federation of Musicians. He appeared on radio and television programs, making the case that New York was about to commit cultural vandalism. The argument Stern made was both aesthetic and practical. Acoustically perfect concert halls were vanishingly rare. Modern architects and engineers, despite advanced technology, consistently failed to create spaces with the warmth and clarity of the great 19th-century halls. Carnegie Hall represented knowledge that had been partly lost, craftsmanship that could not be replicated. Once destroyed, it would be gone forever. Stern also appealed to civic pride. How could New York, which considered itself the cultural capital of America and arguably the world, demolish its greatest concert venue? What would visitors think when they learned that the city had torn down Carnegie Hall to build another anonymous office tower? The decision would become a permanent stain on New York's reputation. The campaign gained momentum through early 1960. Newspapers editorialized against the demolition. Musicians organized benefit concerts with proceeds dedicated to the rescue effort. Petitions circulated, gathering thousands of signatures, but none of this addressed the fundamental problem. Carnegie Hall was private property. Without a buyer willing to preserve it or government action to protect it, public sentiment meant nothing. The breakthrough came when Stern convinced city officials that Carnegie Hall should be purchased by the city of New York itself. The building would become a public asset, operated by a nonprofit corporation but owned by the municipality. This arrangement would ensure permanent protection while allowing professional management. The idea faced immediate obstacles. New York City, in 1960, was not flush with money. The municipal budget was strained by the usual demands of schools, police, sanitation, and social services. Spending $5 million to purchase a concert hall seemed extravagant, particularly when many city neighborhoods lacked basic amenities. Robert Moses opposed the purchase. He argued that government should not be in the business of subsidizing concert halls for wealthy audiences. If Carnegie Hall could not survive commercially, its failure demonstrated that the market had rendered it obsolete. Spending tax money to preserve it was sentimentality masquerading as policy, but Stern had allies. Mayor Robert Wagner, facing re-election in 1961, recognized that saving Carnegie Hall would generate positive press and demonstrate cultural leadership. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, himself a patron of the arts, indicated support for state involvement if necessary. Several members of the city council and state legislature began drafting legislation that would authorize the purchase. The legislative battle consumed most of 1,960. Stern testified at hearings, describing the hall's irreplaceable acoustics and cultural significance. Other musicians appeared alongside him: the director of the Metropolitan Opera, the president of the Juilliard School, and representatives from every major musical institution in the city urged lawmakers to act. Opposition came from unexpected quarters. Some classical music advocates worried that government ownership would lead to political interference in programming. If the city controlled Carnegie Hall, would politicians pressure management to book popular entertainers over serious artists? Would programming decisions be made based on ticket revenue rather than artistic merit? Others questioned whether the building was truly irreplaceable. Modern acoustic engineering had advanced considerably since 1891. Perhaps a new hall could be built that matched or exceeded Carnegie Hall's qualities. The Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts was already under construction on the Upper West Side. Its main auditorium, Philharmonic Hall, was being designed specifically for orchestral performance. Why not wait for that facility to open? Stern had answers for every objection. Government ownership would be purely custodial. Day-to-day management would rest with an independent nonprofit board. As for Lincoln Center's new hall, no one knew whether it would sound good until it opened. Gambling Carnegie Hall's survival on the promise of an untested building was insane. The demolition remained scheduled. Simon needed to complete the sale. The developer needed to begin construction. Every month of delay cost money and created legal complications. By autumn of 1960, pressure was mounting for a final decision. The critical moment came in April of 1960, when the New York State Legislature passed a bill authorizing the purchase of Carnegie Hall by the City of New York. The bill appropriated $5 million for the acquisition and established the Carnegie Hall Corporation, a nonprofit entity that would manage the facility on behalf of the city. Governor Rockefeller signed the legislation on May 20th, 1960. The building that had been weeks away from demolition was saved. The sale to the developer was canceled. Robert E. Simon Jr. received his $5 million from the city instead. The wrecking crews were dismissed. The rescue had taken nearly 5 years from the initial sale announcement to final resolution. Throughout that period, Carnegie Hall had continued operating normally. Musicians performed to packed houses, apparently determined to enjoy the building while it still stood. Now those performances would continue indefinitely. Isaac Stern became the first president of the Carnegie Hall Corporation's board of directors, a position he would hold for decades. Under his leadership, the nonprofit would restore the building, maintain its acoustic integrity, and ensure that it remained accessible to the widest possible range of musical expression. The near demolition of Carnegie Hall had revealed something important about American attitudes toward cultural heritage. The country had no systematic protection for historic buildings. Structures of enormous cultural significance could be destroyed simply because their owners found demolition more profitable than preservation. The loss of Pennsylvania Station in 1963 would reinforce this lesson and eventually lead to the creation of New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965. But Carnegie Hall itself required immediate attention. The building had been saved from demolition, but 7 decades of use had taken their toll. Plaster was cracking. The stage floor sagged in places. The heating and cooling systems were antiquated. Paint was peeling. The elegant cream and gold interior that had dazzled opening night audiences looked tired and shabby. The Carnegie Hall Corporation faced a difficult reality. The building needed millions of dollars in restoration work, but ticket revenue barely covered operating expenses. Unlike private concert halls that could draw on wealthy patrons, Carnegie Hall was now a quasi-public facility that had to justify every expenditure to city budget officials and maintain broad public support. Isaac Stern proved as effective at fundraising as he had been at organizing the rescue campaign. He solicited donations from musicians, corporations, foundations, and individuals who understood that preserving Carnegie Hall required ongoing financial commitment. The restoration would proceed in phases over many years, addressing the most critical structural issues first, while leaving cosmetic improvements for later. One early priority was documenting exactly what made the hall's acoustics so exceptional. The Carnegie Hall Corporation commissioned studies by acoustic engineers hoping to understand Tuthill's achievements scientifically. The findings were humbling. The engineers could measure and describe the acoustic properties, but they could not fully explain why the particular combination of materials, proportions, and construction methods produced such perfect results. The plaster formula remained partially mysterious. Tuthill had used lime, sand, and horsehair, but the exact proportions and mixing technique appeared to have been lost. Contemporary plaster differed chemically from the 1,891 material. When repairs required replacing sections of wall or ceiling, workers had to match not just the visual appearance, but the acoustic properties, an extraordinarily difficult task. The slight irregularities in the plaster surface, created by the multiple thin layers and how workers applied each coat, contributed to the sound diffusion that prevented harsh echoes. Modern plastering techniques, which aimed for perfectly smooth surfaces, would actually degrade the acoustics. Restorers had to learn 19th-century methods and resist the temptation to improve on Tuthill's work. The wooden floor beneath the audience required similar care. The air gap under the seats contributed to the hall's resonance. Any attempt to modernize the foundation would risk destroying what made the room special. Workers repaired damage using period-appropriate materials and methods, treating the entire structure as a historic artifact that demanded reverence. The restoration work proceeded slowly through the 1,960 seconds and into the 1,970 seconds. The hall remained open and operational throughout, with construction scheduled around performance calendars. Audiences occasionally heard hammering during quiet passages, but most accepted the inconvenience as necessary to preserve the building they had fought to save. Meanwhile, Carnegie Hall's programming continued to evolve. The Beatles performed there in February 1964, during their first American tour. The concert lasted barely 35 minutes, with much of the music inaudible beneath teenage screaming. Critics who had worried that pop music would debase the hall's dignity found their fears confirmed. But the event also demonstrated the building's cultural flexibility. Carnegie Hall could accommodate any form of musical expression without losing its essential character. Folk music became increasingly prominent during the 1,960 seconds. Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Judy Collins all performed at Carnegie Hall, bringing audiences that had never attended orchestral concerts. The hall that had opened with Tchaikovsky now embraced the full spectrum of American music, from European classical traditions to indigenous folk forms to contemporary rock and roll. Jazz artists continued to treat Carnegie Hall as a pinnacle venue. The modern jazz quartet, Miles Davis, and Charles Mingus all recorded live albums there, understanding that performing at Carnegie Hall legitimized jazz as serious art music, deserving of the same respect as symphony orchestras. The hall's reputation attracted musicians from around the world. When the Soviet Union began allowing its artists to tour internationally during the cultural thaw of the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, Carnegie Hall was often their first American stop. Mstislav Rostropovich played cello there. Sviatoslav Richter gave piano recitals. David Oistrakh performed violin concertos. These appearances carried political significance beyond their artistic merit, representing cultural exchange during the Cold War. By the mid-1970 seconds, Carnegie Hall had survived its near-death experience and emerged with strengthened legal protections and renewed public appreciation. But the building needed another major intervention. The restoration work of the 1,960 seconds had addressed structural problems but left cosmetic issues unresolved. The interior looked worn. Modern audiences expected amenities that the 1,891 structure lacked. The decision was made to undertake the most comprehensive restoration since the hall's construction. The project began in 1983 and would eventually cost approximately $50 million, 10 times what the city had paid to purchase the building 23 years earlier. The work was funded through a combination of city appropriations, state grants, federal historic preservation funds, and private donations. Isaac Stern led another fundraising campaign, now in his 60s, but still deeply committed to the institution he had saved. The restoration aimed to return the main hall to its opening night appearance, while discreetly modernizing backstage facilities and public spaces. Workers stripped away decades of paint to discover the original cream and gold color scheme. They repaired the ornamental plasterwork that decorated the boxes and balconies. They refurbished the stage, replacing worn boards with wood matched to the original specifications. The project required extraordinary care. Every decision was reviewed by historic preservation specialists, acoustic consultants, and musicians who understood how changes might affect sound quality. When workers discovered that some previous repairs had actually degraded the acoustics, they removed that work and restored original conditions. The backstage areas received modern amenities. Dressing rooms were renovated and expanded. Climate control was improved. Electrical systems were upgraded to handle contemporary lighting and sound equipment. Elevators were modernized, but all these improvements were accomplished without compromising the hall's essential acoustic character or historic fabric. The main entrance on 57th Street was restored to its original grandeur. The brass fixtures were polished. The marble was cleaned. The archway that had welcomed Tchaikovsky, Mahler, Toscanini, and Horowitz gleamed once again. When the renovation was completed in 1986, Carnegie Hall looked much as it had in 1891, but with infrastructure capable of serving the late 20th century. The reopening ceremony in December 1986 featured a gala concert with Leonard Bernstein conducting. Bernstein had been advocating for Carnegie Hall since the demolition crisis of 1960. Now, at age 68, he returned to celebrate the building's restoration and continued survival. The performance was broadcast nationally, introducing millions of viewers to a hall they might never visit in person, but could now appreciate as a national treasure. Isaac Stern remained chairman of the Carnegie Hall Corporation until his death in 2001. Under his leadership, the institution became financially stable for the first time in its history. The restoration had attracted renewed public interest. Ticket sales increased. Corporate sponsorships provided reliable revenue. The building that had nearly been demolished for financial reasons was now generating sufficient income to maintain itself without continuous crisis. Stern's commitment to Carnegie Hall went beyond administrative duties. He continued performing there regularly, his violin filling the space he had fought so hard to preserve. When asked why he had devoted so much energy to saving a single building, he reportedly said that some things, once lost, can never be recovered. Carnegie Hall was one of those things. The musicians who performed at Carnegie Hall during these decades understood they were participating in something larger than individual concerts. This was the stage where Horowitz had played his American debut, where Toscanini had conducted, where Bernstein had shaped American musical culture. Every performance carried the weight of that history, while also adding to it. Yo-Yo Ma gave recitals there regularly from the 1,970 seconds onward. The cellist spoke of how the hall's acoustics allowed him to play with nuance and subtlety that would be lost in less refined spaces. Itzhak Perlman, Joshua Bell, and other violinists made Carnegie Hall a regular stop on their tours, treating it not as just another venue, but as a destination in itself. Popular musicians continued to seek Carnegie Hall performances for the prestige they conferred. Judy Garland had sung there in 1961, one of her last great performances before her death in 1969. Frank Sinatra performed there multiple times. Liza Minnelli followed her mother onto the same stage. The Beatles had played there in 1964, and though their concert was chaos, it demonstrated that rock and roll had earned acceptance in spaces previously reserved for classical music. The 1,990 seconds brought renewed attention to Carnegie Hall's role in American cultural history. The building appeared in films and documentaries. Books were written about its architecture and the artists who had performed there. Tourists began adding it to their New York itineraries, not just to attend concerts, but simply to see the building itself. In 1997, Carnegie Hall received a National Medal of Arts, the highest official recognition of artistic excellence in the United States. The award acknowledged not just the building, but the institution it had become, the generations of musicians it had showcased, and its contribution to American cultural life over more than a century. The turn of the millennium found Carnegie Hall in perhaps the strongest position of its existence. The building was structurally sound, acoustically perfect, financially stable, and legally protected. The near demolition of 1,960 had become a cautionary tale about what can be lost when economic considerations override cultural values. The rescue campaign led by Isaac Stern had created the template for preservation movements that would save countless other historic structures in the decades that followed. But questions persisted about why Tut Hill's acoustic design remained so difficult to replicate. Lincoln Center's Philharmonic Hall, renamed Avery Fisher Hall in 1973 and later David Geffen Hall, had opened in 1962 with high expectations. The architects and acoustic consultants had access to modern technology and scientific understanding far beyond anything available in 1891. Yet the hall's acoustics were widely criticized as muddy and unbalanced. Multiple renovations attempted to fix the problems, each time at enormous expense, with mixed results. Other modern concert halls faced similar challenges. Some sounded acceptable but not exceptional. Others, despite costing hundreds of millions of dollars, were acoustic failures requiring fundamental reconstruction. The mystery of Carnegie Hall deepened. What had Tut Hill understood that modern experts did not? One theory focused on the plaster composition and application technique. The multiple thin layers created a surface that was simultaneously hard and porous in ways that contemporary materials could not match. The horsehair mixed into the plaster added structure and irregularity. The lime-based formula had properties that differed from modern gypsum plaster, but knowing these facts did not mean they could be replicated. The craft knowledge required had largely been lost. Another theory emphasized the proportions of the hall itself. Tut Hill had designed a shoebox shape with specific ratios of length to width to height. Those proportions had been derived from European halls that predated scientific acoustics. They were based on centuries of trial and error, folk knowledge passed from builder to builder. Modern architects often departed from these traditional proportions in pursuit of architectural novelty, then discovered that acoustics suffered as a result. A third theory suggested that Carnegie Hall's perfection resulted from fortunate accidents. Perhaps the specific lumber used in the floor had unique resonant properties. Perhaps the foundation settling over years had created beneficial stress patterns in the walls. Perhaps factors that Tuthill never consciously controlled had combined to produce extraordinary results. If this theory was correct, Carnegie Hall was literally irreplaceable. No amount of money or expertise could recreate the exact conditions of its construction. Whatever the explanation, musicians knew empirically that Carnegie Hall remained special. Young performers spoke of making their Carnegie Hall debut with the same reverence their grandparents had expressed. Established artists returned year after year, treating the building with affection usually reserved for beloved instruments. The hall had personality, character, a quality that transcended physical measurements. The 21st century brought new challenges. Digital recording and streaming services changed how people experienced music. Audiences could listen to the world's greatest performers without leaving home. Concert attendance declined across America as younger generations chose other forms of entertainment. Carnegie Hall, like all performing arts venues, had to justify its existence in an era when technology provided easier alternatives. The institution responded by expanding its mission beyond simply presenting concerts. Educational programs brought students into the hall for interactive sessions with musicians. Community outreach initiatives made performances accessible to audiences who might not otherwise attend. Carnegie Hall became not just a venue, but an active participant in music education and cultural advocacy. The building underwent another significant restoration beginning in 2003. This project focused on areas that had been inaccessible during the 1,980 renovation. Workers restored the Stern Auditorium, the main performance space, which had been named in 2003 to honor Isaac Stern following his death. The two smaller venues within the building, Zankel Hall and Weil Recital Hall, also received attention. Zankel Hall, opened in 2003, was constructed in space that had been closed off since the 1,890 seconds. The original recital hall beneath the main auditorium had been converted to a movie theater in the 1,890 seconds, then later used for other purposes before being abandoned. Architects excavated below street level, creating a flexible performance space for chamber music, contemporary works, and experimental programming. The new hall allowed Carnegie Hall to present a wider range of music while preserving the main auditorium for traditional symphonic and solo performances. The legal protections established after the 1960 crisis proved essential as real estate values in Midtown Manhattan climbed to astronomical levels. The land beneath Carnegie Hall became some of the most valuable in the world. A developer purchasing the site today could theoretically build a tower generating hundreds of millions in revenue. But landmark laws made demolition impossible. What Isaac Stern had fought for now had force of law behind it. In 2015, Carnegie Hall announced a comprehensive restoration and improvement project with a budget exceeding $230 million. The work would address infrastructure that had aged beyond practical repair, update accessibility features to meet modern standards, and enhance backstage facilities for performers. The project was planned to proceed in phases over more than a decade, with the hall remaining open throughout. The restoration required the same careful balance that had defined previous renovations. Modern building codes demanded upgrades to fire suppression systems, electrical infrastructure, and accessibility, but every change had to be evaluated for potential acoustic impact. Workers continued to treat the main auditorium as a fragile instrument that could be permanently damaged by careless modification. The plaster surfaces remained a constant concern. Small cracks appeared regularly and required repair using traditional techniques and materials. Finding craftsmen who understood 19th-century plasterwork became increasingly difficult as those skills vanished from the construction trades. Carnegie Hall maintained relationships with specialized restoration firms capable of working with historic materials. Throughout these renovations and expansions, the hall's acoustic perfection remained its defining characteristic. Musicians still spoke of performing there as uniquely satisfying. A pianist could play the softest pianissimo and trust that every note would reach the back row. An orchestra could build to thunderous fortissimo without the sound becoming muddy or harsh. Solo voices filled the space without amplification. The building still worked exactly as Tut Hill had intended 130 years earlier. The contrast with modern halls remains striking. In 2015, the new Whitney Museum of American Art opened in Manhattan with an auditorium designed by renowned architects using sophisticated acoustic modeling software. The space sounded acceptable, but not exceptional. That same year, Hamburg's Elbphilharmonie Concert Hall opened after years of construction delays and budget overruns totaling nearly $1 billion. The acoustics received mixed reviews, with some musicians praising them and others finding them problematic. Carnegie Hall, built for $1.1 million in 1891, continued to outperform venues that cost hundreds of times more in inflation-adjusted dollars. The lesson seemed clear. Acoustic perfection required something beyond technology and money. It demanded craft knowledge, attention to detail, and perhaps an element of good fortune that could not be engineered or guaranteed. The building's significance extended beyond music. It had become a symbol of preservation's importance, proof that old structures could remain vital and relevant. The near demolition of 1,960 and the successful rescue campaign had helped create America's historic preservation movement. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, established in 1965, directly resulted from the loss of Pennsylvania Station and the near loss of Carnegie Hall. Today, thousands of buildings across America enjoy legal protection because activists followed the model Isaac Stern established. Communities that might once have accepted demolition now fight to save historic structures. The economic arguments that nearly destroyed Carnegie Hall carry less weight in a culture that has learned to value heritage alongside profit. Carnegie Hall hosts more than 250 performances each year, from classical symphonies to jazz quartets to world music ensembles. The programming reflects the diversity of contemporary musical culture while maintaining the artistic standards that have defined the institution since 1891. Young musicians still dream of making their Carnegie Hall debut. Established artists still consider performances their career highlights. The building has witnessed American history across 3 centuries. It opened when electric lights were novelties and horse-drawn carriages filled the streets. It survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and multiple periods of urban crisis. It nearly died during an era when old buildings were considered obstacles to progress. It was saved by musicians and citizens who understood that some things, once lost, can never be recovered. Standing at 57th Street and 7th Avenue today, Carnegie Hall looks much as it did on opening night in 1891. The buff-colored brick exterior, the Renaissance arches, the dignified entrance that welcomed Tchaikovsky and Horowitz and Bernstein. Inside, the cream and gold auditorium seats 2,804 people, almost exactly the capacity Tut Hill designed for. The stage where legends performed remains fundamentally unchanged. The plaster that Tut Hill mixed and applied still covers the walls and ceiling, diffusing sound with the same perfection it achieved 130 years ago. The building endures not merely because it was saved from demolition, but because it continues to serve its original purpose with undiminished excellence. Carnegie Hall is not a museum. It is a working concert venue where the world's finest musicians choose to perform. The acoustics remain perfect. The prestige remains undimmed. The music plays on. What began as Andrew Carnegie's philanthropic vision survived demolition through citizen activism and has been preserved through decades of careful stewardship, stands as testament to what cities can become when they value culture alongside commerce. The hall that skeptics mocked for being too far from civilization became the center of musical culture. The building that developers wanted to demolish for profit is now legally protected as irreplaceable. Carnegie Hall's survival proves that preservation is possible when communities decide that some things matter more than money. The doors still open, the lights still shine, musicians still walk onto that stage and fill the hall with sound. And somewhere in the walls and ceiling and wooden floors, Tut Hill's acoustic genius continues to work its mystery, doing what modern technology cannot replicate, making Carnegie Hall what it has always been. The greatest concert hall in America, perhaps the world.